to Know Christ, a television ministry of the Lutheran Church of Peace in Platteville, Wisconsin. Here is your host, Reverend Jeff Pedersen.
Well, today our emphasis, our subject matter is going to be refugees. And so a refugee is somebody who is seeking refuge in another place. And so as we think about in the Bible and also throughout history, there have been cities of refuge. And this would be like in the Bible, like if you accidentally hurt somebody or killed somebody, that there were cities of refuge where you could go there and you could then seek and get protection, and you then were guaranteed a fair trial. But then there are also nations that would always open up their borders to people who are struggling in lands for various reasons. You know, sometimes the reason could be because there is a famine. Sometimes they are fleeing because of war. Sometimes they're fleeing because of an atrocious leader. And so we hear a lot of the stories. Matter of fact, as we read in the Bible, there are so many stories of God's people who are seeking refuge in another country because there's something bad, there's something harmful that's going on in their own land, and so they've got to leave. For the sake of their own lives, for the sake of their own safety. And so I think about, for instance, God's people, or I think about, during the history of the Bible and God's people during the time of Jacob. Jacob, who later then became Israel. Well, if you remember, he then had his 12 sons. And that's one of his sons being Joseph. And it's from these descendants that became the 12 tribes of Israel. But before that happened, there was a great famine that happened in the land of Canaan. And so what ended up happening is, well, before this time, that Joseph, was sold by his brothers because they were jealous of him as a slave in Egypt. Well, as a result of that, eventually they ended up, the whole family ended up going to Egypt because, well, they needed grain. They needed food. There was a great famine that was going on, and so one of the things is that Egypt always had food. And why did Egypt have food and not the rest of the nation? Because after all, Egypt is a very arid nation. Well, the fact of it is that it has to do with the Nile River, that the Nile River, the water would go in a delta region as the Nile would flood, and then that would produce crops, always guaranteed crops. It was just the natural irrigation. And so they always had food there. So people around the world, or at least the nations around there, that as they were going through a drought in a time of famine, they would go to Egypt. And thankfully, Egypt was always there with open arms to say, yeah, you come here, and we will take care of you, we will feed you, and make sure that you are safe and okay until things settle down in your own land, and then you can go back. And so that's generally what ends up happening with refugees, is that they go into a foreign land, and they're just there to escape danger, and they're there protected until finally things hopefully settle down in their own lands where they can return, because everybody wants to go home. Everybody does. And so that's where the time came when God's people then left. Well, the time came being that life was good for them in Egypt, but then they were eventually, over the course of hundreds of years, then brought into a slave system, which, was unfortunate. But then God freed them, and then they went back to the land of Canaan, where they conquered it. But that's the story for another day. And so we're an example of God's people who were refugees. Well, then there was another time where God's people were defeated by, the Assyrians, but then eventually the Babylonians, and then they were held in exile. And that wasn't maybe so much of a refugee situation as it was more of a exile or a time of captivity for them. But I want to read this story. It's from Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 18. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I call my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more." Well, if there's one story that I think that people know, it's the Christmas story. I must say that of all the times of the church year, the church that I serve is the most full at Christmas time. And if there's one story that I think the Sunday school kids really learn, it's the Christmas story. Why? Because they have the Christmas pageant and they dress up. And so, yeah, it'd be nice if we could learn all the stories as well as the Christmas story. But Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and we just love that story. You know, Mary and Joseph and, the angel and the Magi, the shepherds, the angels, and, all the animals. And the little baby Jesus lying in the manger. Oh, how wonderful that story is. I mean, it is. It's, thank the Lord, praise the Lord. Jesus was born to us. And how nice Christmas is when we got all the trees and the decorations and the presents and everybody is joyous with all the music. But it seems like with all the frills, it all seems to come to an end pretty fast if we continue on with the story. Because there you have Mary and Joseph. And they are now recognizing that they are in danger. Because Herod, the king, is getting wind that there's been a child, a potential king, that has been born. And back then, kings were very suspicious of anybody who wanted their throne, including their own kids, because a lot of times their own kids were trying to figure out some mutinous way to get their dad's throne. And so sometimes kings would actually have their sons put to death. And so I'm not going to go into all these kings that maybe you don't know about, but one of them would be King David. I mean, he had 2 sons that ended up dying because of their wanting to take over the kingship, taking over their father's throne. And so this is where a king, nobody's going to take my throne, including my own kids. And so they get wind that there's, what, a prince, a king has been born? Oh, I'm going to have to take care of this. Let's nip this in the bud. And how did he find out about it? Well, there were magi. There were people coming all the way, some like from the Persian Median area, the Medes, some 600 to 700 miles away on camel, because in their religion, they would look at the stars and they would, determine things based on the constellations and star movements. And they saw the star that they saw, and that meant that, boy, a king has been born to the Israelite people. And so we need to go there because we want to pay homage to this king. And so when they got there, that's when they were, going into Jerusalem, and they were asking the political people, well, I know this is all going to sound odd to you, but, according to our religion, we saw a star and that there is a child, a future king that has been born here recently, and we're wondering, do you know anything about it? And they're all like, who, what? And Herod is going, what? A king has been born? Somebody's going to take my throne? I'm not going to let a little infant take over my throne. And so now the big scramble is to try to figure out, is there any truth to this? And so they went then to the religious leaders and just kind of said, well, if a king were born to your people, where would the king be born? Well, they knew from their prophecy, as you read in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, that the king would be born in Bethlehem. Okay, Bethlehem, that's our targeted area. And so that's where we need to go and look, that if there's a king born, this little baby would be in Bethlehem, or at least in this little area here. So at least we now have reduced our search now to this one little pinpointed area. And I guess that's one of the things with Secret Service and investigating, is that hopefully when you're trying to solve a case, that you can get down to where, okay, it's got to be right in here somewhere. And so they were right. And so King Herod was trying to fool the Magi by saying, well, just, take me to this little baby so I can worship him too. But they're all warned in dreams by an angel saying, get out of here. Herod's up to no good, including Joseph. Joseph and Mary saying, you need to flee Bethlehem and you need to go to Egypt. Once again, Egypt. That's the thing about Egypt, is that Egypt we always kind of look upon as being kind of that villainous nation, because after all, they are the ones that held God's people as slaves or were working them as slaves. But other than that, as we look at their history, Egypt is always that kind, hospitable nation to say that we are a refugee nation. If you're having problems in your land, you come here. We will welcome you in, we will feed you, we will take care of you, and hopefully when everything kind of gets resolved in your own land, you can then go home. They're all set up for it. And so that's where Joseph takes Mary and the baby Jesus, where they hide out. And isn't it something? Just to show how Herod and how ruthless he was. He had all the children in and around Bethlehem, all the boys that were 2 years of age and younger, put to death. Can you imagine how horrific this would be for a community? I can't imagine. Think about it. Now, this is the story that we relate to. That somebody is that evil, somebody is that wicked, somebody is that atrocious, that they would go and kill all these little babies, these 2-year-olds, all the way down to infants, because they were paranoid. They felt like somebody was threatening his throne. And so that's where Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus were, until the day came when the angel spoke to them saying, it's okay, you can now go back and you can go now. Actually, they were from Nazareth, that you can go and now back to your home, being Nazareth, and that's where you can raise Jesus. But isn't it something? It was quoted, the prophecy from Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Now, if we remember, Rachel was one of the matriarchs. Rachel was a wife to Jacob. Matter of fact, Joseph was Rachel's son. Well, here I'm getting everything confused. Joseph, one of the patriarchs, who had the coat and who was sent to as a slave, or was sold as a slave to Egypt and then became second in line to the Pharaoh. And that's what saved them. That's the Joseph we're talking about. That would be Rachel's son. But now, of course, we're talking about Joseph, who's the son of, or the father of Jesus. But Rachel, she was considered to be a beautiful woman, just kind of the model of a mother, just this very special person. And so all of Israel, even today, they look at Rachel as just kind of being that motherly figure. Her tomb, it's just between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. It still exists. It's a tourist spot. And so between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, as people are going, they oftentimes will go and see Rachel's tomb. But that tomb existed that when God's people were defeated in Babylonia, or the Babylonians came down and defeated God's people, Judah, that as they were being deported and going up into Babylonia, they were passing by Rachel's grave. Rachel weeping for her children, for she will not be consoled. And that's one of the things about a mother, and also for a father, for that matter. When they lose a child, when a child dies, that is the most horrific thing. That is a grief that you never really ever overcome. It's always there. The pain and the sadness of losing a child. That no matter how much you try to console that mother or the father, and there's really no words that you can speak to try to make it all better, it's just a grief. The mourning, the weeping. The child that I used to hold is no more. And so that's where, as they were all walking by her grave, Rachel is weeping. And so that has always been used as a prophetic voice, that whenever there's hardships going on in Israel with the people of God, that Rachel is weeping for her children. That this is a time of mourning. This is a time of distress. Things are not good in the land right now. And so now, Bethlehem, which is just right very close to Rachel's tomb, when all these children 2 years of age and younger are put to death by this atrocious leader, King Herod, Rachel is weeping for her children, and she cannot be consoled. Can you imagine the pain, the suffering, the mourning, the weeping that is going on in Bethlehem, to where it's got to still weep today? What a horrible story. But then it's also quoted by the prophet Hosea in chapter 11, verse 1, that out of Egypt I've called my son. And so when God's people were in Egypt, and with the Exodus, and then also but then when we think about the captives up in Babylonia, but then also the captives that some went down to Egypt, that out of Egypt I've called my son. And so that's a prophecy. Out of Egypt I call my son, and that son being Jesus. That Jesus embodies the whole nation of Israel, but also now embodies all nations of the world. Out of Egypt I've called my son. And the son is Jesus, who grows up, and he goes about his ministry. He's the Messiah who dies on the cross for the salvation of all the world. That he's here now to unite all nations of the world, that he is here to bring peace. He's here to reconcile us with God and to reconcile us with one another, so that we will know war no more, that we will know death no more. That we as nations can gather around Jesus and that we can live at peace. That we can see other nations as being our brothers and our sisters in Christ. It reminds me of in Norway, around the 13th century, there was civil war that broke out in Norway. And so there were factions, and there was the prince that was born, Prince Haakon. Well, the opposition, they wanted to find this little baby and to kill the baby. But Norwegian soldiers, they took that little infant prince and they skied that prince over a mountain range and brought that little prince to safety. Well, that prince grew up to be the king that united Norway. And that, of course, then becomes the legend of the Birkebeiner. That's the ski marathon. And so they have a ski marathon in Norway every year called the Birkebeiner. There's the American Birkebeiner, and that is held in Hayward, Wisconsin every year. But I always think about that. And I've done that ski race, and so I always try to envision myself as I'm doing this. I have to keep going because I got to save the king. Like it's my responsibility to be this, in a sense, this Viking soldier to get the king to safety. What about refugees? That there's, unfortunately today, a lot of refugees, displaced people who are fleeing for their lives, or they're taking their families. Why? Well, for things like, mainly because, number one, you got an atrocious leader, or just simply bad government. You've got drug cartels. You've got havens of terrorists in these places. And then as a result of that, you have fighting. And then with fighting, then there's no place to go to work and there's no food. And so you're hungry. And so finally it's like we don't want to leave home, but we've got no choice. You got to pack up your family and you head out. And you're looking for a place, any place, where there will be people who will welcome you and receive you and take care of you, and who will say, this is your home as long as you need for it to be your home. It can be your home indefinitely, but if you decide that after a while, if things settle down in your homeland, then you can head back. But in the meantime, we're here to take care of you. And so that's always what God has called his people to be, are compassionate and welcoming to the stranger, to the alien, to the refugee. And I read in Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. Keep on loving each other as brothers. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing some people have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember those in prison, as if you were their fellow prisoners, and those who are mistreated, as if you yourselves were suffering. And then I think about Jesus, that very powerful words of his from Matthew chapter 25, but specifically verse 35, he says, welcome the refugee, welcome the stranger. And as you do, you welcome me. And so can we see that it is Jesus who is at our gate? And that Jesus is expecting his people to be compassionate wherever they are. Because we have to remember that the church is not just exclusively in the United States, but it's in other countries as well. And so this is not an issue of being Democrat. It's not an issue of being a Republican. It's an issue of being a Christian. That if you're a Christian, this is what God has called you to do. It's an unarguable point. If somebody's in trouble, if the stranger's at our door, bingo, we help. Oh, do we help these people? We think that they're a caravan of evil people who are going to come and take over our land, and they are going to destroy us. No, they're just people who have got nothing, and they are running for their lives, and they're looking for a compassionate person like you who will welcome them in, at least for a time, until things settle down where they can go back. That is what God is calling you to do this day. Because after all, if you're a person of God, you have some compassion in your heart. You have some compassion for Jesus. Jesus who is in our midst. Jesus who is at our gate or at our border. I've been in other countries, and it's amazing how other countries have welcomed refugees in. And I was in Stockholm, Sweden. I'd run the marathon there, but here again, I look like somebody from Sweden. Matter of fact, my immigration came from Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. And so when I go into these countries, they speak the language, thinking that I'm one of them. But I have to say, no, speak English. But in the taxi, after the marathon, I happened to notice, now normally you get into a taxi, you keep your mouth shut, and you just tell them where to go. I could kind of tell, I just said, where are you from? Because I could tell he wasn't Swedish. And he said he's from Palestine. I said, oh, I've done work in Palestine. And he got all excited. We started talking. I said, I know Pastor Mitri Rahab from Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem. He says, yeah, I know. He says, yeah, the schools and things. That's where he kind of come from. I thought, boy, if this wasn't a divine providence moment. But he wasn't there in Sweden to try to create problems. He was just there because in Palestine, it's very hard for the Palestinians right now. And so he's there with his family taking refuge and working a job, being a productive citizen. And so Christian people are a nation that are set up to help people. Just like, if we have a fire, we call the fire department. If we are having a heart attack, we call the ambulance. Well, we're all set up that if there's one of our neighboring nations that's having a problem where they need to come and seek refuge, that's where we are here to say, welcome. We are here to take care of you. And you can be here as long as you want, but if you end up leaving and going back into your country, God bless you and we wish you well. But it is the Christian's responsibility to take care of the refugees.
You have been watching To Know Christ with Reverend Jeff Pedersen, pastor of the Lutheran Church of Peace in Platteville, Wisconsin. The worship schedule for the Lutheran Church of Peace is Saturday night at 6 p.m. and Sunday morning at 9 a.m. A collection of Pastor Pedersen's Christian books can be found at Amazon.com. His latest book is called Sharing Our Faith and the Covenant of God's Grace. Thank you for watching, and tune in again next week for To Know Christ.